Good morning, everyone. I'm Dick Levinson. On behalf of the Senior Center here at Central, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our program this morning. Our focus today is on Pontius Pilate, the man that nobody knows. And I say that because while everyone knows what Pilate did, there are very few people alive today who have any real sense of what he was like as a person and how he managed to secure that very sensitive post as the provincial governor of Jerusalem, which then, as now, is certainly a global hotspot. Our guest this morning is Suzin Weber. She is simultaneously a committed Christian, a senior leader at the Free Library of Philadelphia, and a PhD candidate. I'll be introducing her in just a few minutes, but before I do, there are several points I want to touch on briefly. First, I want to tell you that our next program will be produced on Friday, October 10th at 11 o'clock in the morning. Our focus at that time will be on a program called The Dark Prince, the life and career of the Irish playwright Martin McDonagh. So if you love theater and if you care about Ireland or Irish culture, this is a great program for you, and I hope that you'll be able to join us. A quick reminder now that you can send a question to our guest this morning, Suzin, at any point during the program this morning. Just look for the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. That's where you would go to send a question to her. She's happy to respond to your questions and will at the end of her presentation. Now, we would love to have you on our mailing list. And if you're not there already, joining is so easy to do. Just shoot me an email at Levinson. It's Levinson, it's Levinson R, at freelibrary.org. Now, here are some things you should know about our guest this morning, Suzin Weber. Suzin supervises a number of critical departments in the Parkway Central branch of the Free Library of Philadelphia, departments that people depend on for access to timely and up-to-date information, let alone access to books and a variety of other materials. You should also know that Suzin is a committed Christian and a lifelong student of religion. Suzin is very active in her local Presbyterian church, has been for many years, including being invited to give numerous guest sermons, which she has done. I think during the course of this talk, Suzin may or may not want to say something about the PhD that she is working toward completing. But for the moment, I'm delighted to say, welcome, Suzin. It's a pleasure to turn the program over to you.
Good morning. Thanks, Dick. And thank you very much for having me to talk about Pontius Pilate, the man that nobody knew. Many of us are familiar with the role that Pilate plays in New Testament scripture, but there's very little that we actually know about Pilate as a human being. For example, we do not know his birthplace. We don't know anything about his family, not his parents, his wife, children, siblings. We don't know anything about his career before he was appointed prefect of Judea. We don't know anything about his career after his term in Judea ended. We even don't know his actual name. He was not born Pontius Pilate. So we will get to that in a little bit about what his actual name may or may not have been. So when we begin an exploration of anybody from significant history, we want to look for contemporaneous sources. And there's a very limited number of contemporaneous sources that tell us about Pilate. There's Philo of Alexandria, Josephus, Tacitus, and the gospel accounts in the New Testament books, along with an item called the Pilate Stone. So the first thing that we look to is the Pilate Stone and Tacitus, because they're both secular documents that help us to establish that Pontius Pilate did in fact exist, and that he was in fact the prefect of Judea when Jesus was crucified. So the Pilate Stone was discovered in 1961 in Caesarea Maritima, which is where Pilate's residence in Judea was located. It includes a partially intact inscription dedicating a temple to Emperor Tiberius, which is referred to on the stone as a Tiberium, and deifying the Emperor Augustus, who was believed to have become a god upon his death. And the stone reads that Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, dedicated this building. Now, Tacitus, who is generally considered one of the greatest of Roman historians, wrote around 116 AD in Book 6 of his Annals, after discussing the aftermath of the Great Fire of Rome which occurred in 64 AD. He wrote, quote, "Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome." So Tacitus also verifies the existence of Pontius Pilate, and he verifies the crucifixion of Jesus during the administration of Pontius Pilate. So those are the only two contemporaneous secular sources that we have. Philo, Josephus, and passages from the New Testament Gospels would all be considered religious-based sources. So Josephus, he lived from approximately 37 to 100 AD. He was a Jewish historian, scholar, and military leader. And through Josephus's records, we know that Pilate served as prefect in Judea from 26 to either 36 or 37 AD and was appointed by Emperor Tiberius. Two of the most famous works of Josephus are the Jewish War, which was written around 75, and the Antiquities of the Jews, which was written around 94. And in both of these documents, Josephus records 3 instances where Pilate incited religious and political violence in Judea. In the first instance, right when Pilate arrived in Jerusalem, he arrived under cover of darkness, and nobody knew that he was coming. And so the population of Jerusalem awoke the next morning to find that all of a sudden he had displayed within the holy city either shields or standards glorifying Caesar, which was a violation of the Jews' prohibition against iconography, which was considered blasphemy. So they sent a delegation to Caesarea Maritima to protest, and Pilate responded to the protesters by sending out soldiers who drew their swords and threatened to kill them. So that was their first experience of Pilate as their new governor. In the second instance, there was an assembly of Jews that protested Pilate using temple money, which had been dedicated for God's purposes, to build an aqueduct, which was a Roman purchase. Pilate had troops disguised as civilians hiding in the crowd, and upon a signal from Pilate, the troops pulled out cudgels and bludgeoned people to death. In the third instance, a group of Samaritans had assembled a throng that were on their way to their holy mountain, Mount Gerizim, in order to unearth what they had been told were buried relics of Moses. And Pilate sent troops to block them. A battle ensued, and many Samaritans were killed. The Samaritans who survived sent a complaint to the governor of Syria, who reported the incident to Rome, and Pilate was ultimately recalled from his position as a result. Now, Philo of Alexandria, who is contemporaneous with Pilate actually being in Judea, Philo lived from 20 BC to 50 AD. He was a Hellenistic Jewish philosopher who lived in Alexandria, Egypt, and writing circa in the 40s, he described Pilate as, quote, "a man of inflexible, stubborn, and cruel disposition," and, quote, "a spiteful and angry person," whose behavior he characterized as, quote, his venality, his violence, his thefts, his assaults, his abusive behavior, his frequent executions of untried prisoners, and his endless savage ferocity, done with, quote, the intention of annoying the Jews rather than honoring Tiberius. Pilate concludes, Philo concludes by saying that he personally, quote, suffered an infinite number of evils when he was alive. And then lastly, in the Gospel according to Luke, the 13th chapter, verse 1, the author writes, now, there were some present at that time who told Jesus about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mixed with their sacrifices. But there are no extant historical records that provide any details about this incident. Many scholars agree, though, that it's quite possible that at some point a group of Galileans who were suspected of coming to Jerusalem to engage in political violence were killed on Pilate's orders in the temple when they went there to offer sacrifice. So those are the only contemporaneous documents that we have of Pilate. It basically paints a picture of someone who, yes, existed, but was not at all sensitive to the cultural mores of the territory that he had been sent to govern, and had a very strong bent towards violence. Now, what we can extrapolate about Pilate, just from what we know about Roman history in general and Judea in specific, as we said, Pontius Pilate was not given his name from birth. It's more of a title than a name. The name Pontius likely indicates that he was a descendant of the Samnites. Now, the Samnites were an Italic people from south central Italy who fought 3 wars against the Romans, who eventually defeated them in 82 BC and utterly assimilated them. If you're familiar with the relationship between the Spartans and the Athenians and the mutual contempt that was held between them, that would be very similar to the Samnites and the Romans. But ultimately, the Romans defeat the Samnites and assimilate them into Rome. So the name Pontius is a patronymic surname belonging to the descendants of the Pontigens of the Samnites. Now, there are a number of other famous people with the surname Pontius that are recorded in ancient Roman history, including Pontius Comnenus, Herennius Pontius, Gaius Pontius Herenni, Pontius Telesinus, Titus Pontius, Pontius Titianus, Lucius Pontius, Pontius Aquila, Pontius Alphidanus, Pontius Lucius, Pontius Fregelanus, Gaius Pontius Pontius Nigerus, and Marcus Pontius Sabinus. Now, Pilatus, on the other hand, is an honorific that was bestowed upon him during military service. To be a Pilatus indicates a soldier who is highly skilled with a javelin. And this may have come to Pilate as a legacy from his family, because history tells us that Samnites were renowned for their skill with a javelin. So if Pilate did serve in the Roman military, he likely fought in the German campaigns in either 9 or 14 AD, where he likely became hardened against the idea of death and convinced of Roman superiority and virtue. To be called a prefect in the 1st century meant that one had achieved the rank of knight and parlayed their military position to be awarded a governorship of a province. According to Tacitus, Tiberius's criteria for awarding a governor or prefectship was that the man have decent behavior, good character, and not so much merit that he could leverage his position to become a threat to the emperor. So if Tiberius did indeed consider Pilate to have decent behavior and good character, that does shed a different lens on the contemporaneous accounts that depict Pilate as really quite bloodthirsty and lacking cultural sensitivity. Now, as it concerns the relationship between the Romans and the Jews in fact detested the Romans and resented their presence in Judea. They regarded them as backward-thinking idolaters who reveled in violence and were only interested in collecting taxes and engaging in immoral behavior. They were not impressed at all by Roman boasts about their armies or extravagant building campaigns, and they refused to recognize the Romans' pagan gods or participate in the cult of emperor worship. The Romans regarded the Jews with disdain and thought they were extremely backward, too obsessed with their religion to recognize the blessing that being part of the Roman Empire actually was: the provision of peace, roads, access to water, knowledge, the arts. They especially resented the Jewish interest in proselytizing and converting Romans and Greeks into God-fearers. During the first century, there were a lot of factions in Judea, some that sought to profit from the Roman presence, but many more that hoped to one day overthrow the occupation. So insurrection and political violence ran very close to the surface at almost all times. And this was the world that Pilate was sent to govern. And the expectation of Rome was that he would maintain the peace, keep order, and ensure that nothing interfered with the flow of the tax revenues. Now, if Philo, Josephus, and Luke present an accurate picture of Pilate, he either lacked the situational and cultural awareness to not offend the Jews and cause disorder, or he didn't care. Either way, it reflects a lack of aptitude for the position that he was given. Now, there are a number of other accounts of Pilate's origin. There is one story that says he was actually born in Seville, Spain, where a grand house was identified in the 15th century as Pilate's house. There's another story that claims that he was born in Tarragona, in an imperial citadel on the coast of Catalonia that once had been a residence of Caesar Augustus during his military campaigns. In both of these traditions, his birth name was Lucius Pontius Pilate, and his father's name was Marcus Pontius. Lucius traveled to Rome to seek his fortune and liked to hang around the imperial courts trying to ingratiate himself. It was here that he met Claudia Procula, who would become his wife. The problem was that she was a member of the imperial family, and when Tiberius found out about their plans to marry, he allowed them to wed, but immediately after the ceremony sent Pilate packing to Judea, and Pilate did not see his wife again for another 6 years. Now, another origin story says that Pilate was actually German, the bastard son of a king named Attis, and a young woman, possibly a harlot named Pila, hence the name Pilatus. Because he was a bastard, he could not be an heir, and as a teen, in a fit of rage, he murdered his half-brother, the actual heir to Attis's dominion. Because he did have royal blood, it was determined that he couldn't be executed for his crime, so he was banished to Rome to try to make a life for himself. Once in Rome, Pilate committed murder again, and it was determined that his violent streak should be put to good use for the empire, so he was sent to the island of Pontus to subdue the barbarians. He achieved such success in this that he earned the title Pontius Pilate and was awarded the governorship of Judea. These accounts all depict Pilate as presumptuous and violent from an early age, which would explain what is recorded about him by Philo and Josephus. However, these are all just recorded as legends. Now, Pilate in the Gospels features prominently in the events leading right up to Jesus' crucifixion. And that's in the 4 Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In Mark's Gospel, which is likely the earliest of the 4 accounts, Pilate only appears in 15 verses, chapter 15, verses 1 through 15. Here we read, Jesus is handed over to him, and Pilate asks, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Pilate also tells Jesus that he has been accused of many things, and it is recorded that Pilate is amazed that Jesus did not offer a defense. The crowd asks Pilate if he will be honoring the custom of releasing a prisoner on the eve of Passover, and Pilate asks if he should release the king of the Jews, knowing that Jesus had only been handed over by the chief priests out of self-interests. But when the crowd calls instead for Pilate to release Barabbas, Pilate asks, What shall I do then with the one you call King of the Jews?" When the crowd demands that Jesus be crucified, Pilate asks him what crime he has committed, but wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate releases Barabbas, orders Jesus flogged, then hands him over to be crucified. So the 2 important points that come out of Mark's Gospel is Pilate asks, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And also, Pilate has this sense that this is some kind of setup and that the chief priests have done all of this out of self-interest. So Pilate is suspicious. Now, in Luke's gospel, Pilate appears in chapter 23, verses 1 through 25. In this account, Pilate is told that Jesus is a subversive who opposes paying taxes to Caesar and claims to be a king. These two crimes alone should have been considered high crimes against Roman rule. So it was with intentionality that they were presented to Pilate. Pilate again asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He then turns and announces that he finds no basis for a charge against Jesus, to which the chief priests respond that Jesus has been stirring up people from Galilee all the way to Jerusalem. This is meant to emphasize the concern that there could be insurrection as a result of what Jesus is teaching. And again, this should call Pilate to act. When Pilate hears that he is a Galilean, he sends him to Herod, because Galileans fall under Herod's jurisdiction. Herod is pleased to receive Jesus because he has heard stories about his miracles and hoped that Jesus would perform some sort of a sign while he was there, put on a little magic show. When Jesus wouldn't respond to Herod's prodding, Herod and his soldiers ridiculed and mocked him, dressed him in an elegant robe, and sent him back to Pilate. And scripture records that that day Herod and Pilate became friends. Before this, they had been enemies. Pilate then announced that neither he nor Herod found any basis for charges against Jesus and that he doesn't deserve death. The crowd responds by demanding the release of Barabbas, but wanting to release Jesus, Pilate appeals to them again, stating that he found no grounds for the death penalty, but promising to have him punished and then release him. But the crowd becomes loud and insistent that Jesus be crucified, so Pilate relents. He released Barabbas and surrendered Jesus to be crucified. Now, Luke notes further along in that chapter in verse 38 that a sign was hung over Jesus on the cross, which reads, "This is the King of the Jews," but does not identify Pilate with the sign. Excuse me. In Matthew 27, the narrative of Jesus before Pilate is interrupted in verses 3 through 10, with the conclusion of the account of Judas Iscariot's betrayal, his return of the 30 pieces of silver, and of Judas hanging himself in remorse. Then the account returns to Jesus before Pilate in verses 11 through 26. Just as in Mark and Luke, Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the King of the Jews?" As in Mark, Pilate is amazed that Jesus refuses to defend himself against the accusations that have been made against him. Pilate turns to the crowd and asks them if they want him to release Barabbas or Jesus, because he recognized that the crowd was acting out of self-interest. Excuse me. Again, Pilate is suspicious. Matthew adds that Pilate was then interrupted by someone passing him a message from his wife, which reads, "Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him." Pilate resumes asking the crowd whom they want to release, and the chief priests persuade the crowd to demand Barabbas. Pilate then asks, "What shall I do then with Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" When the crowd demands that Jesus be crucified, Pilate asks, "What crime has he committed?" The crowd cries back even louder to crucify Jesus, and it's written that Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but instead of an uproar starting, so he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd, announcing that he was innocent of this man's blood and it was the crowd's responsibility. The crowd then responds, "His blood is on us and on our children." So Pilate had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. Now, in John's gospel, Jesus appears before Pilate in a much lengthier segment. It begins in chapter 18, verse 28, and continues all the way through chapter 19, verse 16. Here, Pilate comes out of his palace to greet them because the priests will not enter out of fear of becoming ceremonially unclean before the Passover. Pilate begins by demanding to know what charges were being brought against Jesus, and he receives a cagey answer. And then he tells the assembled to take Jesus yourself and judge him by your own laws. which they responded that they didn't have the right to execute anyone. As in the other Gospels, Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the King of the Jews?" But only in John's Gospel, Jesus is recounted as having then engaged in a dialogue with Pilate. Jesus asks him how he came to the idea that he was the King of the Jews, and Pilate responds, "Am I a Jew?" Jesus responds to Pilate that his kingdom is not of this world, and that he was born and came into the world to testify to the truth. Pilate then retorts, "What is truth?" and announces that he finds no basis for a charge against Jesus. As in the other accounts, the crowd demands the release of Barabbas. Pilate then had Jesus flogged, and the soldiers put a crown of thorns on his head and dress him in a purple robe. Pilate again addressed the crowd and said that he found no basis for a charge against him. And when Jesus was presented in the robe and wearing the crown of thorns, Pilate said, "Here is the man." John goes on to describe Pilate as afraid of the crowd and says that he asked Jesus where he came from and if he didn't realize that that he had the power to set him free. Jesus responded, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of greater sin." Pilate then tried to set Jesus free, but the Jewish leaders asserted that Pilate would be no friend of Caesar's if he released Jesus, because Jesus said that he was a king, and that meant that he opposed Caesar. They pressed Pilate on this, asserting that they had no king but Caesar, and Pilate finally relented and handed Jesus over to be crucified. In John's Gospel, it is Pilate who ordered a sign affixed over the cross, which read, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews," in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. It's also noted that the chief priests complained to Pilate about the sign saying, "King of the Jews," and Pilate dismissed them, saying, "What I have written, I have written." So that is everything that we actually have that is contemporaneous to Pilate's life. Now, Pilate just explodes into this huge, larger than life character in story and legend. And it begins in the early church, but then blossoms in the period of the Middle Ages and still continues to this day, where Pilate frequently appears in fictionalized accounts of his life. So, part of the reason for this is Christianity first began as an extension of Judaism, with the church centered in Jerusalem. Many scholars believe that Christianity actually made its first inroads into Rome itself through Jewish Christians. But by the end of the first century, Christianity was well on its way to becoming a largely Gentile faith instead of a Jewish one. This transition can be seen in the way that Pilate is actually depicted in the Gospels. Mark, being the earliest Gospel, is actually rather neutral in its depiction of Pilate. Matthew's Gospel, which many believe was written through a Jewish lens, but later than Mark, adds two significant insertions that reframe the culpability of Pilate. First is the warning from his wife, and second is the depiction of Pilate washing his hands of the matter. Luke, which was written for a Greek-speaking audience, deflects blame from Pilate and the empire by highlighting the role of Herod, a Jewish authority, in the abuse of Jesus, as well as adding the double assertion that neither Herod nor Pilate found any guilt in him. By the writing of John's Gospel near the close of the first century, Pilate is actively trying to secure Jesus' release, is described as afraid of the Jewish religious leaders, and has actual conversations with Jesus. He is pressed into turning Jesus over for crucifixion when the chief priests play the "no king but Caesar" card on him, forcing him to demonstrate where his loyalty lies. Now, Pilate's developing presentation continues in the apocryphal writings, such as the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Nicodemus, and the Acts of Pilate, which all openly seek to exonerate Pilate for blame in Jesus' crucifixion. And this parallels the rise of the Roman Christian Church and the emergence of Christian anti-Semitism. So Tertullian, who's considered one of the church fathers and lived between 160 and 240 AD, was the first to write that Emperor Tiberius had been intrigued by the accounts of Jesus that Pilate had written to him in his regular reports, thereby introducing the notion that the empire had been sympathetic to Jesus's message even while he was still alive. Eusebius, who is also considered the father of church history and wrote multiple volumes of ecclesiastical history, lived between 260 and 339, and was directly influenced by Tertullian, wrote that in keeping with Roman custom, Pilate wrote Emperor Tiberius about the crucifixion of Jesus, including rumors that he had risen from the dead, performed wonders, and that there were those who believed him to be a god. Tiberius was intrigued and urged the Senate to investigate if Jesus should be recognized as a deity, but the Senate rejected it. Eusebius shared a 4th century view that the Romans were not to blame at all for Jesus' crucifixion, and that the blame should fall squarely on the Jews, and also that the Jews had lost their privileged status as God's chosen people and were destined to be replaced by the Gentile Roman Christians. By the Middle Ages, there was widespread belief that Pilate had been deeply moved by his interaction with Jesus, especially as depicted in John's Gospel, and that he had come to repentance, and both he and his wife had become Christians and perhaps even went on to become saints. Some stories told that Pilate stood outside Jesus's tomb in the Garden of Gethsemane and prayed for forgiveness in the days between Good Friday and Easter. Other stories, especially the medieval mystery plays, depicted Pilate as under the influence of Satan, as well as being a drunkard and a buffoon, leaning more heavily into the narratives of Philo and Josephus. In these plays, he is juxtaposed against Jesus, who is depicted as calm, controlled, pure, and unfazed as Pilate's words and actions become increasingly extreme. Both the influence of Philo and Eusebius can be seen in these different medieval depictions of Pilate. So these depictions continue in fiction right up to this day, with Pilate either functioning as a great sinner with a dark past, seen wrestling with Satan and his conscience, his wife Procula being a secret believer who sneaks out at night to listen to Jesus speak, Pilate coming to repentance and becoming a Christian, and both Pilate and Procula dying as martyrs. So now we have to ask the question, with such little historical documentation of Pilate's time as governor of Judea, and even as his life before and after that time period, and really such short references to him even in the Gospels and in the historical narratives of Josephus and Philo, why is there so much interest in Pilate anyhow? Is he really that important? So there are several reasons why for centuries people have had fascination with Pilate. First, he's regarded as playing a crucial role in the birth of Christianity. Because Jesus had to be crucified, there has been ongoing speculation about God's predestined design in bringing Pilate to this place and this time where he would perform this crucial role. This has also led to speculation about whether Satan, also knowing the importance of what Pilate had to do, attempted to interfere in bringing this role to fruition, either by threatening Pilate's life or by confusing his focus. So Pilate, therefore, becomes a player in what some see as the cosmic battle between the forces of good and evil, with the overarching question being, which side will Pilate choose? Will he ultimately end up being a tool of evil or become aligned with a force for good? Now, the second thing, extending out of this cosmic scale of the battle between good and evil, Pilate is also seen as the very embodiment of Rome, the quintessentially evil empire that is prophesied to return at the end of the age, along with the rise of the Antichrist. So, in this view, the essence of what Pilate stands for is captured in John's Gospel when he challenges Jesus to tell him what is truth. Jesus is truth. Rome, like the Antichrist, is falsehood. If Pilate can be turned and brought to repentance, this is a depiction of God's power over sin and an indication that anyone can be saved. 3, on the other hand, Pilate has also been used as part of the justification for anti-Semitism. So the assertion goes that Rome did not crucify the Son of God. In fact, Emperor Tiberius was sympathetic to Jesus, as was his representative in Judea, Pontius Pilate. It was the Jews who crucified Jesus. Their virulence against God's Son was so intense that it made a Roman governor uncomfortable and caused his poor wife to have nightmares. So, of course, Pilate's real intentions would come out in the end. And like the empire itself, we see Pilate turn to Christianity. So then we come to the narratives about Pilate's death. In reality, in terms of serious documentation, nothing is known about Pilate's death. But the legends and stories that developed in the Middle Ages, particularly those rooted in Eusebius, Tertullian, and the Apocryphal Gospels, have numerous different accounts of what became of Pilate after he returned to Rome. So in the stories, there's some that say that Pilate converted to Christianity after Jesus' resurrection, and that he actually encountered Jesus through visions. As was recorded by Josephus, he was recalled to Rome to face punishment, but not for the slaughter of Samaritans, as Josephus had recorded. He was instead recalled because Tiberius, who has become intrigued by the letters that Pilate has written to him and sympathetic to Jesus as perhaps a god, Tiberius is enraged that Pilate could have crucified a god. Now, these stories all ignore the fact that Tiberius had died before Pilate even made it back to Rome. In some of the stories, even, Tiberius is alive but gravely ill and was actually hoping that Jesus could be summoned from Judea to heal him, and he becomes angry when he learns that Pilate crucified his best chance for healing. The stories tell that Pilate ended up being either exiled, executed, or committed suicide. Some of the most interesting stories claim that he was exiled to the Alps in either Gaul, which is now France, or Switzerland, where he spent his remaining years living in isolation. And there are numerous sites in the Alpine regions where legends say that Pilate's home stood, or even to this day continues to stand. In a Coptic text from Egypt, the Anaphora of Pilate, Pilate himself was crucified by Herod, survived, was sent to Rome where he was crucified again, and survived that, and then was beheaded. And then he was laid to rest in Jesus's tomb, along with his wife Procula and their 2 children, who dropped dead of joy after seeing Pilate's beheading, and they witnessed an angel appear and catch Pilate's head as it fell. Now, it is actually very likely that nothing at all happened to Pilate, since according to Roman law, Pilate's appointment to Judea would have ended when Tiberius died anyhow, and he would have been recalled no matter whether he had had an issue with the Samaritans or not. And the new emperor Gaius, who we also know as Caligula, it's recorded in his early years of his reign, he was not interested in prosecuting outstanding cases from Tiberius's reign. So it's likely that even if Tiberius had a charge against Pilate for mismanagement, that Caligula would not have pursued it, and Pilate would have just vanished into obscurity. It's suspected that Pilate died likely around 40 AD in relative obscurity, perhaps still living in Rome, or perhaps somewhere in the countryside. So that is what we know about Pilate and what we don't know about Pilate. So does anyone have any questions at this point that they would like to explore? Or anything you would like me to go into in a little bit more depth if I can?
Suzin, I'd like to use the host's prerogative to ask the first question.
Mhm.
And I guess what I most want to ask you is, in everything that you read and researched to put this presentation together, what surprised you the most?
I think what surprised me the most initially was that we really knew nothing about Pilate other than from some very brief sources, because I had believed what's considered to be a myth in scholarship that the Romans documented everything and that we have a tremendous amount of documentation of all manner of things from the Roman Empire. So I had assumed that there were actual letters from Pilate to Tiberius submitting reports about what had been going on in Judea, or that there were letters from other people. For instance, in one of the narratives of Josephus, the sons of Herod wrote a complaint letter to Tiberius about Pilate. I had assumed that at least some of them must have existed, and that there was documentation about what Pilate did before he became governor of Judea. So I was really surprised by the significant lack of knowledge about him and the significant lack of documentation.
I wanted to follow up with one other question, and I know that our audience has must have questions, and gosh, we'd certainly like to see those show up in the Q&A. I wanted to ask you what we know about the Jewish religious leaders and whatever personal or private, or perhaps not so private, agenda that they have in all this, because you've made numerous references to the fact that Pilate was very suspicious, felt that he'd really been set up, that he was being used by these people. What do we know about them?
Well, we can speculate about what Pilate was thinking in terms of being set up, and keeping in mind that he did not spend much of his time in Jerusalem, but only went there for high holy days like Passover, and spent the remainder of his time out in the countryside in Caesarea Maritima or in other places, that you can see that in his mind that he's only just arrived recently in Jerusalem. He's awoken in the wee small hours of the morning by this delegation that has come to make accusation about somebody that he considers to be utterly insignificant, and that they seem to want to play all of these trump cards on him. So there's the Jesus opposes the collection of the tax. Jesus opposes Caesar. Jesus calls himself a king. And Pilate has already had multiple negative experiences. Remember, he was greeted his very first couple of days there with a delegation that came to Caesarea Maritima and protested the standards that he had displayed in Jerusalem upon his arrival. So that was his first taste of interacting with the populace of Judea. Then there was the interaction that he had about the temple money being used to build an aqueduct. So Pilate, you can see, could have a bit of a paranoia that has developed, that they're trying to set him up to get him to say the wrong thing, especially if Josephus' narrative is correct, that the sons of King Herod sent letters to Tiberius trying to accuse Pilate of mismanagement, that he would feel as though this isn't about Jesus at all. Jesus is just an actor in this play. This is about me. They have come to try to make me look bad and make me say something that they can then go back and report to Rome and claim that either I am allowing interference with the taxes, I am allowing the presence of somebody who claims to be king against Caesar, I am supporting insurrection, I am incompetent. So Pilate has surrounded his mind with this wall of how to protect himself. And like I said, to him, it wasn't about Jesus at all. It was about the desire to make him Pilate look bad. So there were multiple factions that were in different positions in Jerusalem at that time. There was, of course, the people who profited from the presence of the Romans because they skimmed off of the taxes that were being collected. And to them, it was all about how much money they could create and enrich themselves with. But then there were the people who were very serious about adherence to Jewish law and custom, and felt that the very presence of pagan Romans in and around holy sites within the Holy Land was a desecration, or at least risking a desecration. And if you remember the narrative about Hanukkah, the Maccabean Wars was not too distant history from the period when the Romans were in Judea. So many people top on their collective memory would be the abomination of desecration that was committed by Antiochus Epiphanes when he supposedly slaughtered a pig on the high altar in the temple, and that blasphemy is still very present. That the Jews managed to get the Greeks out. It wasn't very long, though, before the Romans came in, and to them, the Romans were the Greeks worse, and that they were trying to avoid a repetition of what happened under the Greeks. So the best scenario to them was to get rid of the Romans by any way possible. And to some people, that included extreme acts of violence. Judas Iscariot, for instance, there's a number of scholars who believe that his secondary name, Iscariot, is also a title, like Pilate is a title, and that Iscariot means that he was a member of the Sicarii, and that meant that he was dedicated to insurrection and to the killing of Romans. The Sicarii carried a concealed dagger under their robes and were vowed that whenever the opportunity would present itself, if they could knife a couple of Romans in a crowd, especially, that they would do so. So there's some thought that Judas Iscariot had aligned himself with Jesus in the hope that Jesus would be the one to start a violent uprising and drive the Romans out. So there's a lot of different factors that are involved there. Does that answer your question, I hope?
Yes. Yes, that was a very satisfactory answer. All right,
Okay.
let's take a look now and see what questions we find in the Q&A. Jim says, didn't you mention that Pilate was separated from his wife when he was in Jerusalem? So how can his wife be passing a note to Pilate while Jesus was being questioned?
Okay. So according to the tradition, Pilate was sent to Jerusalem in 26 AD. And if you believe the tradition that says that he was sent to Jerusalem immediately following his wedding to Claudia Procula, it was 6 years before his wife was permitted to join him in Judea. So that would have been 32 AD. Bible scholars generally agree that Jesus was crucified in 33 AD. So she would have been living with her husband for a year before Jesus is brought before Pilate.
Bonnie has an interesting question here and says, thank you, Susan, for a fascinating presentation. Why does Christian education generally ignore the background and motives of Pilate? Why do we not generally delve deeper into this historic figure's role in Christianity?
I think part of the problem is Pilate is so tied up, excuse me, Pilate is so tied up with the justification for the emergence of anti-Semitism that delving into that is something of a hot button issue for contemporary Christians. And it's difficult to talk about Pilate without having to have that conversation of how his story was manipulated to justify anti-Semitism, but also because there's a lack of really serious scholarship around Pilate. So if you strip away all of those traditions from the period of the late early church into the Middle Ages, you really have nothing to go with on Pilate. You have what is in Scripture, what is in Philo, what is in Josephus. And Philo's mentions of him amount to an extended paragraph. Josephus mentions of him amount to several pages. And then you have the gospel accounts, and it paints a picture of, in Philo and Josephus, an arrogant, self-serving man prone to acts of violence, whereas the Gospels present him as somebody who feels backed into a corner and sacrifices Jesus primarily to keep himself from getting in trouble. And that's really all we know about him. So there's not a lot that, from like a Christian biblical studies standpoint or serious Christian theological standpoint, that we can do with Pilate, other than hold him up as somebody that you really need to teach against what tradition says about him, because tradition is just legend, and a lot of it is genuinely incorrect, because clearly Pilate could not have stood trial in front of Tiberius and been beheaded by Tiberius when Tiberius had already been dead for months by the time Pilate made it back to Rome, from when he was recalled from Judea. So that's really why the church doesn't spend much time delving into Pilate, because there's not a lot there. And then if you go to the reason why there's historically been such interest in Pilate, again, those are hot button issues that have to be handled within the context of a larger study. You know, if you're going to talk about prophecies of the end of the age and the idea of a new Roman Empire arising and the coming of an Antichrist to lead the new Roman Empire, and how Pilate acted as an embodiment of everything that was evil about Rome, you can't study that accurately unless you understand what apocalyptic literature is all about. Because to take apocalyptic literature, like the book of Revelation at the end of the New Testament, if you take that as literal prophecy, that's going to cause all manner of problems, because it never was written to be intended as future literal prophecy. Apocalyptic literature serves a completely different purpose within the Judeo-Christian tradition of that time and needs to be understood as such. For instance, Daniel and Revelation both serve the same purpose, to discuss the fact that while God's people are being oppressed by the forces of this world, evil empires, social injustice, are the victims of marginalization and assorted forms of violence directed specifically against them because of their faith, the sovereignty of God and God's intentional protection of them, with a plan for them to come out in the end as still God's chosen people who will inherit the blessings that God has for them, so long as they prevail and adhere to their faith. That's the central message of apocalyptic literature. It's not look up into the sky and you're going to see a dragon fly over. Oh, and by the way, on the dragon's back is a woman named Babylon. And watch out for the Antichrist, because the Antichrist is going to take over a reiterated version of the Roman Empire. That's not what apocalyptic literature is meant to communicate. It's meant to communicate, hold fast to the faith. God is with you. God will reward you if you hold fast to the faith. Do not become weak of heart and dispirited.
Marjorie has a great question here and says, what impact might various translations from one language to another to English have on the myths and the facts, in quotes, the myths and the facts of history?
That has more to do with the authoritative reliability of translations. In some cases, it can have a tremendous impact. For example, if we look at the Masoretic text of Hebrew scripture, and then you compare it to the Greek translation, which is known as the Septuagint, and then compare that to the original Latin translation known as the Vulgate, there are a couple of significant differences in word choice that come in there because the original concept in Hebrew didn't translate the way that we might hope it would have into Greek and then into Latin. Now, it's important to note that that is not a frequent case. So when scholars go through and they do comparative translation studies from Hebrew to Greek to Latin, those are isolated cases, and we do have the Hebrew to go back to, and you can come to an understanding of why, for instance, the Greek scholars who translated the Hebrew text into Greek would have changed the wording because they were trying to make it make sense to the audience that they were doing the translation for. And the same thing happened when it got translated from the Greek into the Latin. But that's why study of archaeological languages is so important, that the further we can get back with original documents, even if they're partial fragments, like the finding of the scrolls at the Qumran community, how important they have been for translation. The more that we can find and the more knowledge that goes into understanding the correct interpretation of original languages is important for us to critically evaluate how well things have been translated down through the centuries. And there's, of course, a couple of famous examples in Josephus, because at some point, a Christian revisionist got a hold of some of the works of Josephus and inserted verbiage into what Josephus wrote that would create the impression that Josephus became a Christian, when in fact we have no evidence that he ever did. So again, through ongoing study, you can actually see that the language changes and that the word choice that represents a real Josephus document suddenly changes, and you can question, well, where did that insertion come from? Because no place else does Josephus use this phrase. No place else does Josephus conjugate this way. This no longer sounds like Josephus wrote this. So the amount of scholarship that goes into antiquarian archaeological linguistics is very significant, and I would argue one of those things that we should be concerned that universities continue to be able to fund, support, and that people learn and continue to go into those careers, because we cannot lose world history to the fact that people are not learning how to do deep translation and archaeological linguistics.
I would like to do a quick shout out now to Ray Bonwell, who is a Presbyterian pastor and who steadfastly, in many different ways, supported this program and helped to spread the word about it. And we're very grateful to Ray for his interest and support. He has a great question here, which says, which begins by saying, "Thank you for the thoughtful and thorough presentation. Within world Christian communities, can you speak to how Pilate is thought of warmly in the Eastern Coptic Church, I believe perhaps canonized for proclaiming the innocence of Jesus?"
Yes, so I did not spend a lot of time researching Pilate in the Coptic Church, but let me find the document. One of the primary documents that comes out of the Coptic Church is the Anaphora of Pilate. And in the Anaphora of Pilate, Pilate is so moved by his interaction with Jesus in John's Gospel, and also his wife Procula has secretly been following Jesus by sneaking out at night to listen to some of Jesus's teachings, that after the crucifixion, Pilate goes to the tomb and repents in front of the tomb and is a recipient of one of Jesus's post-resurrection appearances. And Pilate goes on to become a very outspoken supporter of early Christianity and is that's why he ends up being crucified by Herod, because he becomes a thorn in Herod's flesh by his advocacy for the rights of Christians, the validity of the resurrection, and the validity of the Christian message. And that's why Pilate is beatified, sanctified in the Coptic Church, because of his role in that.
Joan Marco has an interesting question here and says, I think you said that the Jews resented the Roman occupation, but then said, or then pointed out that they said there is no king but Caesar. These ideas seem contradictory to me, but maybe I'm recollecting them incorrectly. Could you clarify?
No, I did definitely say that, and that's part of the reason why Pilate felt like he was being set up, because Pilate would have been knowledgeable of the fact that the Jewish population did not appreciate the Romans being there, and that they actually considered the Romans to be backward pagans and unwelcome invaders in their land. So when Pilate is speaking to the Jewish priests and is trying to advocate on behalf of Jesus that he doesn't see anything criminal in what Jesus did, they play the Caesar, no king but Caesar trump card on him. And it put Pilate into a situation where for him to repudiate that would indicate that Pilate was not a strong enough devotee to the deity and majesty of imperial Caesar, which of course Pilate was. And it caused him to have to lean into the crucifixion of Jesus instead, because he would have implicated himself to have done otherwise. Does that make sense? I hope.
Bonnie has a great question here that I think many people are or will be interested in. She says, to what extent are there other figures in the Bible who we know little about? What factors lead to this relative obscurity and lack of curiosity?
Well, some of the relative obscurity is caused by the fact that we're talking about a time period where the majority of people were not literate. So they did not keep journals. They did not write letters. So there's a number of people that we're going to know nothing about. We're fortunate to just have names of them because they didn't keep records of themselves. Then you couple it with the fact that they never were a truly significant individual to begin with. They were just one of the billions of people that have walked the earth through the course of human history. They were important to their friends, they were important to their families, but they never, quote, made a name for themselves in either politics, finance, religion, military, what have you. So they were born, they lived, they died. And except for the people who immediately loved them, they were lost to the passage of time. And there's a number of people that are mentioned in scripture that the only place that we know that they existed at all is the fact that they were mentioned in scripture, simply because of that. In fact, I was reading a blog as part of this research where the author was responding to the assertion that if we don't have enough documentary evidence of somebody existing, then how can we assert that they actually existed if the only mention of them is that they show up as a name in the Bible? And I thought that the blogger made a very good response, that of these billions and billions of people that lived all the way through the course of human history, most of them we have no record of them existing, other than maybe they are an aside mention in some other document. There's some of them that we completely accept that they existed without further documentary evidence. And then there's others that we single out and want to investigate, why should we believe that this person existed? So there's kind of a, I think we kind of have an unrealistic expectation, like I had said earlier. For instance, the myth of Roman documentation, that I myself believed that Romans kept records of everything. Well, they may have kept records of a lot, but they couldn't have kept records of everything. When you think of all the people that ever lived during the Roman Empire, you wouldn't be able to double check on the existence of every single person. So you may not know that at one point there was an extremely important shopkeeper who lived in Jerusalem for 40 years and had many, many important conversations with many significant people, but nobody ever wrote it down, and now they're lost to history. And I think that's part of the reason why we don't study everybody. Like, for instance, there's really very little that we know about Barabbas.
I'd like to jump in here. Sherry has asked a question that I'd like to respond to. She says, will this presentation be available to listen to again or as a transcript? And so, Jerry, what I want to say is that this presentation was recorded, and we're going to do a little light editing, possibly, and then it will be uploaded to the Free Library YouTube channel, where it will be available on demand 24 hours a day. And I will send out a general notice so that you and the other people who I know will be interested will be aware of when it will be available on demand. So we will let you know. And Suzin, here finally is the question that we all suspected was coming. From someone who wishes to remain anonymous, but it's still a good question. This person says, so who killed Jesus? I had learned Pontius Pilate. Others say the Jews. Others blame Judas.
No one person did. I mean, technically, yeah, no one person did. And I think that's part of what's important to keep in mind, because when you look at Jesus's role as the redeemer of humankind, and that he takes on the role of the spotless lamb who is sacrificed and whose blood is shed for the remission of sins, it's important that no one person killed Jesus. Jesus needed to be killed by humanity writ large as a system. He needed to be killed by the Roman government, but he also needed to be killed by the religious leaders, and he needed to be killed by the people, because it's only in that collective guilt of everybody that when you see Jesus taking away the sin of the world, that the world can be represented in that. So theologically speaking, he takes away the sin of the Jews. The Jews killed Jesus. But he also takes away the sin of the Gentiles, because the Romans killed Jesus. And in so doing, everybody killed Jesus. So everybody is eligible to have their sins expunged by Jesus's sacrifice and by his resurrection. So there is no one person.
Ms. Norton asks a great, well, actually, it makes a very interesting point, I think. She says, as you present the complexity of the history at the time of Pilate and what we cannot know for sure, I feel much more sympathy for Pilate than the way he is so often portrayed as a totally evil man. So I guess that's a comment if you care to make a comment about that.
No, it's understandable because once you see his interaction in the Gospels, which is actually the most in-depth narratives that we have about Pilate, where we actually have documentation of Pilate speaking, you can understand how he is trying very hard to be a reasonable individual and a sensible politician, and that he's trying to walk this extremely complicated catch 22 between doing something that he does not believe is necessary, which would be turning Jesus over to be killed, and maintaining his charge to prevent insurrection, maintain the peace, and keep the taxes flowing. So failure at his job could result if he did not turn Jesus over. However, that's why he asked that question, what is truth? Because it's believed that he was burning with that question in that moment. Where is the truth in all of this? Because he felt as though he was being set up. And what is truth? Is truth his job as a politician that says, maintain the peace, prevent insurrections, and keep the taxes flowing? Or is truth following your conscience and not sending people off to be killed if you don't feel as though there's any justification for it? As an interesting aside, Roger Williams, the founder of Providence, Rhode Island, he was a Baptist leader. He made an argument at one point that he did not believe that any seriously religious person could ever be a politician, because to be an effective politician, sometimes you have to do things that go against your conscience. And if you were seriously devout about your religious beliefs, you would never do things that go against your conscience. But for the sake of the greater good of the republic, of the state, of the nation, what have you, sometimes you have to bruise your own personal conscience in order to do what is necessary for the state.
All right. At this point, we have two remaining questions, and I wanted to comment on one of them before I give you a chance to comment also. An anonymous audience member says, in terms of translation, the horns on the head of Jews is one of the mistranslations, right? I wanted to very quickly cite the personal experience of my late father, Sam Levinson, who served, in the Army during World War II. And as part of his training, he spent some time in Mississippi, where he attended a local dance sponsored by the community there. And he was dancing with a local woman in this Mississippi community. And she kept staring at him in a way that he found odd. And finally, my dad, who was a New Yorker and who was brought up, I mean, to just say what was on his mind, said to this woman, you keep eyeing me very, very strangely. What are you looking for? And in response, she said, well, I was hoping to see the horns. So, that's more than just an idle question, I think. So what of her point about this idea of horns on the head of the Jews being a mistranslation?
I'm not sure where that comes from. Um, you know, my guess is that it would have something to do with the way that the devil is depicted as having horns. And if you believed in things like the synagogue of Satan, that would be why Jews would have horns, but in the grand scheme of things, that there's a word for that, and I'll use the word bunko, because Jews don't have horns, and Jews are not satanic, and they are not the synagogue of Satan, and there's no place in scripture that says that they are. So I'm not sure where. I assume someplace in medieval tradition must be where the idea of Jews having horns comes from. And I don't know whether or not that could be based in a mistranslation out of Latin or perhaps out of Greek or even something else entirely. I'd have to see it and be able to look it up.
All right.
But
Well, certainly
yeah.
we can't expect you to know everything, even though it's obvious you know a tremendous amount. So, given that we're already over time, this is has been a fascinating presentation. But I do want to have you address a final question, which is asked for us by Linda Ritterman, who says, why is there complaint about Jesus being killed if Jesus came to earth to die to take away people's sins?
How do we explain that theologically? I suspect on the one hand that would be grounded in the belief that to lay hands on the Son of God is to lay hands on God himself. And for anybody to have done that would have been to commit such a heinous blasphemy and act of violence against the Almighty that one would expect, in human terms, that they should have been struck dead right on the spot for having blasphemed so. It probably is also associated with the expectation that if Jesus was innocent and was as powerful as people said that he was, and that he radiated this sense of love and talked about the importance of forgiveness, that to try to destroy something that good speaks so much to the darkness within the human heart that it is almost unconscionable that we as human beings could attack the good so badly. And it causes us to have to look at our own reflection in the mirror and ask to what degree we are like Pilate and caught in this web of self-preservation versus seeing and hearing the truth and not being brave enough to act on it. Does that
Susan,
make sense?
let me say, I think that is a great note on which to end. I want to thank you for a really remarkable and thoughtful presentation. I mean, this, I think, is one of the programs that the Free Library of Philadelphia should be proud to have presented under the library's auspices in terms of uh, promoting and disseminating knowledge, which is what we're all about and what the library stands for. So this was a great job. Thank you. Want to thank our audience for being with us. A quick reminder, please join us again coming up on October 10th for the program about the Irish playwright Martin McDonagh. I want to wish everybody a great day and a good weekend. Take care.
Thank you.